Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DriveThruRPG review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the DriveThruRPG.com website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the Dungeon Adventure Keepers of the Pale Flame, designed by MT Black Games for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. I believe this is like the 7th or 8th MT Black title that I have reviewed on this channel over the years. I may be near the top of most reviewed designer that I've had the privilege of looking through. Not necessarily all of them glowing reviews either. I've certainly had some criticisms. What I do appreciate is Black has always had a very consistent style and consistent strengths, which is dungeon design. And obviously, I've always said that D&D is perfect for dungeon design. It's the whole name of the game, and specifically all of the mechanics in 5th edition are designed to make the dungeon crawling experience work so beautifully, which is why every adventure that's centered around a dungeon crawl, you're usually already one step ahead of the game. This particular adventure takes place in a haunted lighthouse, which I feel like is a fairly tropey cliche thing. Like, although I don't think I could actually rattle off a bunch of haunted lighthouses necessarily. It just feels like kind of a classic adventure location. Very Lovecraftian also, because it's horror and it's the ocean and it's the horror of the deep and all that. And I feel like those are all very Lovecraftian themes, although this one isn't necessarily that. And this takes place in MT Black's homebrew fantasy world of Iskander, which I did previously review one of those source books. However, you don't need to really know any information about that particular setting. None of that necessarily has anything to do with this adventure. It's very self-contained, which is very handy because that lets you drop it in to the Forgotten Realms or wherever you want to put it. It is designed for 5e, so it has 5e rules. It just happens. It takes place, obviously, in a coastal village with a lighthouse, and that's pretty much all you need to know. It is a 3rd level adventure. It has adventure adjustments from 1 through 4, and MT Black also is very consistent on providing the same presentation, layout, and design, which is this kind of easing format where it's small, kind of thin pages with very big font and very little artwork. And we do have map art, but it's the Dice and Logos kind of hash marks and black and white cartography, which I have never been much of a fan of as somebody who prefers really richly detailed, full color virtual tabletop maps. Despite that, I do really love how MT Black designs dungeons. My goodness, the dungeon design philosophy is so good. If I were teaching a class on just good game design for D&D 5e or any RPG, I would absolutely be citing MT Black's dungeon design specifically, because something he does, filling out every single room with something interesting. For example, just flipping through here real quick, you can see every single room of this lighthouse takes up a full page. There is no wasted space here. There's always just something interesting in every room, whether it's a secret door or it's, creepy handwriting on the walls, or it's some loot to find or a monster to battle or some kind of haunted water to avoid. Like, there's just something going on in every single room. Now, this is a smaller dungeon. It's not as big as some of the other ones I've previously reviewed of his work, which were more like 20 rooms. This one is just about a dozen rooms plus a little cave at the bottom. This feels like it would fit very well into one of those anthologies, like a Journey to the Radiant Citadels or a Candlekeep Mysteries or something, kind of that length, where it's just based around a single location area. Now, granted, there is a whole little village at the beginning during the first chapter where you gain some information and learn about limited information if you can, which is basically like, hey, we need you to go to the lighthouse and figure out what's going on. So as a backstory here, there was a reef god who exists in the bowels of the caves beneath this, I guess, where the cliff where the lighthouse resides, and she manifests as a siren, and she's luring ships into the rocks and shoals, and they're breaking apart, which is sort of the ironic opposite of what a lighthouse should do. A priest was able to figure out how to subdue this evil god by doing a series of rituals that involve lighting candles. That's where the name of the pale flame comes from, which is very cool. You light the big light on top, which is the lighthouse, and then the pale flame at the bottom to keep the monster at bay. I guess you never really don't get a chance to converse with this god, so I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's the difference of the lore in Iskander, where the gods are just kind of monstrous and they're, I don't know, don't really act like gods from what I'm saying. They're kind of petty. Maybe more like Greek mythology gods in that way. And then the priest also determined you had to sacrifice animals to the god to keep it satiated and basically slumbering. And then I believe that was like once a week or something. And then every 20 or 30 years, you had to actually sacrifice a human to keep it fully satisfied and slumbering. But it was more of those like, well, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of few, because this could save hundreds of lives if we just nuke one person nobody cares about. And this has been going on for a while, and then you've got this latest keeper of the lighthouse, and it's been passed down from lighthouse to lighthouse, keeper, who basically lost his nerve and didn't want to do it, didn't want to kidnap anybody and kill them for this god, this dark god. And then the dark god awoke and just started doing what it was doing before, and just started luring ships to their death as a siren. And then the poor keeper ended up just hurling himself off the top of the lighthouse and killed himself, and then turned into a poltergeist that now haunts the lighthouse. So the poor next person that came to try to take over was so haunted by the experience that she was able to leave. And then the next, that was from the city, and then somebody from the village decided to finally come in and take over because somebody's got to run the lighthouse. And she was ultimately murdered by the poltergeist. And now the village is like, all right, seriously, there's something going on. It's clearly haunted or messed up. We need to send in the adventuring party. And meanwhile, there's the reef god is still doing its thing. So what's weird is that the two stories are linked because it's the same location, but you're actually going in as kind of a like, okay, why is this place haunted? What's going on? Which is the whole, okay, now the person who killed himself is now a poltergeist and just randomly, ragefully killing people that enter there. And then you discover this whole other story, which goes deeper, literally and metaphorically, which is that the poltergeist was a person that just couldn't go through with keeping this reef god in check. So you eventually have to go down into the bowels of the lighthouse to figure that out. So I think it's a decently compelling background story, and it leads to a very fun boss fight at the end. Black's strengths have always been to the dungeon design and not necessarily to creating a interesting story around that dungeon, with obviously some variations between each adventure. I think this one toes the line pretty well, but I didn't think it was particularly just amazing in terms of the story. And the one thing I think it lacked is there was no chance to talk to anybody once you entered the dungeon. So you got the full first chapter where you get the quest from the warden, and then you do get to talk to one of the guys who it was his girlfriend that wanted to run in. I think girlfriend who wanted to run in, and the third person who basically tried to run the lighthouse and ultimately fell victim to the poltergeist. You get to get the quest, I guess, the additional quest for him to, hey, go check on her and make sure she's okay, even though it's been days. I don't know, where the hell have you been, man? So the party goes in, and just every room is cool and interesting in terms of having dangers and traps and secrets and just creepy like scrawled writings on the wall. You can tell that the designer is probably a good like Lovecraftian or horror fan, because I think it comes through very well with the atmosphere and just how haunted everything feels, and the bloody handprints and all that feels just very interesting from a cool like horror standpoint. This could almost make an interesting Halloween one shot, especially if your players aren't necessarily into just straight up horror, because I think it's actually, how do I describe this? It feels like it is appropriately creepy, and yet it never quite goes into full on like terror horror, if that makes sense. Like you do kind of, there's a really cool handout, which you get a full page handout. I'm gonna skip to the end. I can show this to you. There it is, where you learn all of which I'm so thankfully included this. A lot of designers make the mistake and include the big like WTF going on, like journal entry thing at the very end, like after you defeat the boss. And instead, here you get it maybe about halfway through the dungeon in a study. You figure out this really cool, like the reef will feast, she will eat and eat and eat, like this very cool stuff. Must make the great sacrifice. No one likes it, but it must be done, or she will wake and eat Minnie. Choose someone that none shall miss. Like very well written and very cool. That looks like it's written, handwritten, and all that. I love that you do get this opportunity to look at this, but there's no chance to talk to anybody. There's nobody to rescue. The only person that's in there is dead already. The poltergeist, there's no reasoning with him, for example. That's probably the one bit I would add, is because the poltergeist has very strong story connotations as being essentially the first victim, although he was just killed himself basically because he couldn't go through with it. I would probably add some story stuff for the poltergeist. Maybe after you defeat him, maybe there's a little, scene of him, kind of explaining things a little bit, just because otherwise there's no real chance once you enter the dungeon to talk whatsoever. So I'm always looking at if it's checking those check boxes of exploration, social, and combat. And I feel like, yes, it has that little, quest giving part at the beginning with the village. Everybody's going to basically do that. But then there's nothing for that social box to be checked once you're in the dungeon itself. However, combat-wise, it does pretty well. There's nice, little combat here, bone crabs, gray oozes, and the poltergeist is a really cool opportunity where you end up in the there's like a creepy trench, which is like a garbage chute or something in the basement, and then you hear like this help voice coming from down, like a female's voice, and you are supposed to like get down there and check it out, and that's when the poltergeist is just doing that to fuck you up, and then it uses its like force slam ability to knock you into the pit, which I thought was a very cool ambush attack that it can pull off. And then it's a very cool multi-stage boss battle at the end with the Reef God, who is first a siren and then transforms into this giant mantis shrimp thing, which is like this huge 10-foot long aquatic creature. There's sharks in the water around there, and there's also things the players can do to help ward themselves using various items that they've acquired. For example, they can learn about the whole candle thing. They can light the candles down there, which do actually have an effect in the battle. It's not just story stuff. It's like, hey, if you actually go through with this, you can gain, advantage against the saves against her siren song, for example, and then she will gain disadvantage. So I thought that was really interesting and really adds kind of the reward, almost adventure gamey in a way, to reward the players for exploring more of the location. There's a good bit where you find a key on on the dead body upstairs, and that's what lets you into the basement down below, which is fun because it always tricky to me when I'm looking at designing dungeons, of how to kind of softly gate the players into making sure they explore a good chunk of the dungeon before making it to the end, too quickly. Use the classic like Zelda boss door design, for example, but try and obfuscate it maybe a little bit more if you can, not have it be so obvious. So I think from a dungeon design, it does very well, and from a combat design, and then from an exploration, just phenomenal. Like, honestly, incredible the way there's so many different traps, and I don't think there's not really any puzzles per se, but I like the fact that there's a couple traps, and there's just a lot of just really good atmospheric, creepy stuff going on that really drives home the fact that this is a haunted lighthouse and feels just, I don't know, very interesting and cool to explore, and almost to where you kind of forget the fact that there's really not a whole lot of story going on here. But the difference between maybe this one and one of the previous ones I reviewed, which was, The Secret of Stranglelight Hall, which I did think that one was weak on the story despite being a good dungeon crawl, is this one is shorter. So if it's this one's about half as long of a dungeon as the other one, and if it's shorter, that means the lack of story, I think, is less egregious, because you're not really running into the lack of story development as much when you're just popping in there, and you can pretty much get this done. I think in a one shot. This is actually even in our, my crew runs 2.5 hours an average session. A one shot, maybe we could stretch to 3 hours. I think honestly we could even do this in a 3 hour, although that boss battle would be a lengthy one for sure, and that would probably be the majority of the time because it would be a pretty epic big encounter. But I think this would work for a one shot for sure, and again for more of a horror, kind of almost classic horror lighthouse thing, although I think that's a trope, and yet I can't really think about any others that I've seen do that. But it feels like it would fit very well in kind of an anthology setting for sure. That is Keepers of the Pale Flame. All right, let's go over my pros and cons. Keepers of the Pale Flame is a short but detailed dungeon with something interesting to uncover or battle in every room. I cannot say this enough about how good MT Black's dungeon designs are, specifically in how every room is filled with something. Now, if I actually did the math, which I should have going into this, it probably feels like it's 1/3 combat, 1/3 danger, and 1/3 just technically empty, or maybe with loot or something. But yet even the empty ones feels like there's something in there, because there's, the creepy handout to find, or maybe a key, or some, like, written messages on the wall. They don't feel empty. Don't feel like you're just opening a broom closet and the DM says like, yep, this looks like a broom closet, just because you want to have rooms in there. There's something going on in every single room. But granted, this is a lighthouse with very few rooms, so you kind of do want to fill things out a bit, but still, absolutely thumbs up on how good of a dungeon design this ends up being. Pro epic multi-stage boss battle against an aquatic goddess, although again, gods in the Iskander setting may be a little different because it's just kind of a powerful shape-shifting monster. It doesn't even have any it just seems feral, like there's no socialization or anything there. It's just you fight this, but it's still a cool boss battle, right? You fight the siren then turns into a giant mantis shrimp. She can summon a swarm of shrimp, and then there's sharks in the water, and then you can do other things, like I said, lighting the candles to help give advantage. And then there's a certain kind of blood you can find, which is like the blood they use to sacrifice to mollify the goddess, and that actually does stun her like for a number of rounds. So I love the fact like all these things you learn actually come into play and help you during that boss fight. That's very cool and satisfying. And pro encounter adjustments for levels 1 through 4. There's not a whole lot of actual boss battles, but I do appreciate that a lot of work has been done on the designers. Instead of just saying, hey, reduce hit points or add this, it's like, hey, no, remove like certain abilities, or, you know, cut this many monsters, or add this and make sure they do max damage and all that. That actually does help a lot. Designed for 3rd level, but anywhere in tier 1, I think you can pull this off pretty satisfyingly. My only real con is really the map. So it uses that, again, Dyson logo style map art, which I know a lot of folks are perfectly fine with this, and if you are, then that's great. I personally don't like it. I've never liked it. It's just when your whole I do appreciate this sketch of the side, by the way. That's actually very helpful. Obviously, having a map just for visualization purposes is critical, but not being able to actually use this in a virtual tabletop would be a big bummer, because that means I would have to then recreate this whole map in order to use this dungeon crawl, because this whole adventure is the dungeon crawl. So that is a huge negative, and unfortunately is always looks like it's always going to be a negative for this particular designer who for whatever reason doesn't use the any kind of full color map designers. Also, 1 square equals 10 feet is a bummer, but I guess that's how we fit it on one page here. I thought about putting the lack of story as a con, but honestly, as I said, I think because of the shorter length of this adventure, and just the way it did the atmosphere and exploration so well, it didn't bother me as much. But hopefully you can tell from my review that it is very, very light on the story overall. And I would, if I were running it, I would probably add a few more story things. For example, the poltergeist especially having a scene either during the battle or after the battle where you can maybe have a chance to speak to him a little bit, just to help check that box. Final verdict: Heapers of the Pale Flame is a classic haunted lighthouse dungeon crawl with an appropriately creepy atmosphere leading to a well-constructed boss battle. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com, and you can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. And you can support my work at patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Thomas, Stan, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic, Roleplay Roll, Christopher, Brian, William, Corey, Koa, 1337, Big Nut, John, Chris, Scott, Gene, Eric, Dan, Tyler, Nathan, Camp, Crystal Lake, Counselor, Big Shep, Andrew, and Daryl. And gold patrons RPG Paper Crafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lion, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fasaga, Tortoise, Scott, Refus, Caroline, and William. Thank you all very much for your support.